guy married into royalty. Their secret almost broke me. Part 2. The room smelled like sandalwood. That was the first thing I noticed when I stepped through the doorway. Kasper's candle, the one from his study, had been brought into the living room and placed on the table beside the open journal, like some kind of ceremonial offering. The flames flickered gently, casting soft shadows across the walls, and for a brief, absurd moment, the scene almost looked peaceful. But there was nothing peaceful about the way Kasper was sitting. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was clenched and his eyes were red, not from crying, but from the kind of sleeplessness that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him is about to give way. And beside him stood the Queen. She wasn't sitting. She would never sit for something like this. Standing was a power position, and this woman understood power the way a surgeon understands a scalpel. She wore a navy dress with a single strand of pearls at her throat, her silver hair swept back in its usual immaculate style, and her hands were folded in front of her with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She had been waiting for me. They both had. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. The silence was so heavy it pressed against my eardrums like water pressure deep beneath the ocean. I stood in the doorway, with my coat still buttoned, my phone still in my pocket, and my pulse hammering so hard I was certain they could hear it from across the room. The Queen looked at me the way she always looked at me, with that measured, appraising gaze that never quite reached warmth. But this time, there was something else behind it. Something sharp, something cornered. I had seen that look before, in courtrooms back in London, on the faces of witnesses who had been caught in a lie, and were calculating in real time how to spin it into something survivable. She spoke first. Of course she did. "Amara," she said, and her voice was steady, almost gentle, the way a blade is gentle right before it cuts. "Please close the door and sit down." I didn't move. I didn't close the door. I didn't sit down. I stood exactly where I was, because something deep inside me understood that the moment I followed her instructions, the moment I obeyed, I would be stepping into a script she had already written. And I refused to play a part in another one of this family's carefully staged productions. The Queen noticed. Her left eyebrow lifted by a fraction of a millimeter, the only crack in an otherwise flawless performance. "We know what you've done," she continued, adjusting her tone the way a pianist adjusts tempo, subtle but deliberate. "You entered Kasper's private study without permission. You accessed personal documents that do not belong to you. You photographed confidential materials that are protected under royal household privacy statutes." She paused to let the weight of her words settle over me like a net. "This is not a small matter, Amara. What you have done constitutes a serious breach of trust, and it raises significant legal concerns that the family's counsel is already reviewing." She delivered every word like a verdict. It's not angry, not emotional, clinical. She was framing me, right there, in real time, standing in my own living room. This woman was constructing a narrative in which I was the villain. Not her son who had fathered a secret child. Not the family who had conspired to hide it from me. Me. The woman who had dared to open a drawer and discover the truth. I looked at Kasper. He hadn't spoken. He hadn't even looked up. He sat there with his head bowed, staring at his clasped hands like a man sitting in a church pew, waiting for absolution. I searched his face for something, anything, a flicker of remorse, a trace of the man who had whispered, "I love you," in my ear just nights ago. But all I saw was a man who had chosen his side long before I walked into this room. He was not going to defend me. He was never going to defend me. He had been raised by this woman, shaped by this institution. molded into a man who understood that the monarchy came first, and everything else, including love, including truth, including me, came second. The Queen was still talking. She had moved on to discussing discretion, responsibility, the importance of protecting the family's legacy. She used words like delicate and complex and mutual understanding, diplomatic language designed to soften what was really being said, which was this: be quiet, accept what happened, and fall in line. I let her finish. I let every carefully constructed sentence land in the space between us. And when she was done, when she stood there with her chin slightly raised and her pearls catching the candlelight, she waiting for my response with the quiet confidence of a woman who had never in her life been told no by someone who mattered, I asked my question. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I looked directly into her eyes and said, "When you sat in that meeting 2 years before my wedding and decided that I didn't deserve to know your son had a child, did anyone in that room say my name? Did anyone ask what it would do to me? Or was I just a line item on an agenda that you checked off and moved on from?" The room went cold. Not figuratively. I swear the temperature in that room dropped. Kasper's head snapped up. The Queen's composure, that fortress she had spent a lifetime building brick by meticulous brick, flickered. It was only for a second. A tightening around the eyes. A barely perceptible shift in her breathing. But I saw it. See, and she knew I saw it, because my question had done something her entire strategy hadn't accounted for. It had moved the conversation from what I had done to what they had done. And in that single shift, the entire power dynamic in the room tilted on its axis. She opened her mouth to respond, and for the first time since I had known this woman, nothing came out. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that palace. I stood there in my old wool coat, with no crown on my head and no title in my voice, and I watched the most powerful woman in the kingdom search for words she couldn't find. And I understood something in that moment that changed everything. They were not afraid of what I had found. They were afraid of who I had become, and they were right to be. Please subscribe to this channel if you would like to get notified when we publish stories that you might like. Let's continue with the story. The morning after the confrontation, the palace moved with a speed and precision that told me this was not their first time handling a problem like me. I woke up to find that my personal assistant, a young woman named Elise, who had been one of the few genuinely kind people in my daily life, had been reassigned. No explanation was given, no goodbye was offered. She was simply gone, replaced by a woman in her 50s named Gerda, who smiled with her mouth but never with her eyes, and who appeared at my door each morning with a printed schedule of approved activities and a demeanor that made it clear she was not there to assist me. She was there to watch me, my morning walks in the palace gardens, the only window of privacy I had used to communicate with Priya, were suddenly accompanied. A security officer was assigned to walk with me at all times, positioned close enough to hear any conversation I might have, close enough to ensure I never again had a moment that belonged only to me. When I asked why the security protocol had changed, I was told it was a routine adjustment. When I pressed further, Gerda looked at me with that empty smile and said, "Her Majesty feels it is important that you are well protected during this difficult time." Protected. The word sat in my mouth like something rotten. On the second day, my phone disappeared. I left it on my bedside table while I showered, and when I came out, it was gone. In its place was a new device, sleek and expensive, with a palace crest engraved on the back. Gerda explained that all members of the royal household were being transitioned to a new secure communication system, and that my personal device had been collected for data migration. She said it so smoothly, so rehearsed, that I almost admired the craftsmanship of the lie. My old phone had contained my encrypted messaging application, the channel through which I had been communicating with Priya and the legal team. They knew. They might not have known the specifics, but they knew enough to cut the line. I held the new phone in my hand and felt the walls of the cage tightening around me. Every app was palace approved. Every call would be logged. Every message would pass through their servers. They had handed me a leash disguised as a gift and expected me to wear it with gratitude. But they had made a miscalculation, a critical one. See, they assumed that cutting off my communication meant cutting off my support. What they didn't know was that Priya and I had prepared for exactly this scenario. 3 weeks before the confrontation, during one of my garden walks, Priya had told me something I would never forget. She said, "Amara, assume that at some point they will take your phone, monitor your movements, and try to isolate you completely. When that happens, do not panic. Everything we need is already outside those walls." She was right. The photographed journal pages were already stored on encrypted servers that the palace couldn't touch. The legal team in London already had their copies. My witness statement had already been drafted, reviewed, and secured. The palace was frantically locking doors inside a house that had already been emptied. They just didn't know it yet. So still, the isolation was suffocating. Not having access to Priya, to my mother, to anyone who existed outside the palace's carefully controlled ecosystem, was like having oxygen slowly reduced in a sealed room. You don't notice it at first. The air still feels breathable. But with each passing hour, each passing day, you begin to feel the thinning. Your thoughts slow down. Your confidence wavers. You start to wonder if maybe you are the problem. Maybe you overreacted. Maybe the journal wasn't as damning as you remember. Maybe the queen was right and you violated their trust, and this is the natural consequence of your own recklessness. That voice crept into my head like poison dripping through an IV line, slow and steady and almost imperceptible, and I recognized it for exactly what it was. Because I had studied this, I had represented clients in London who had been subjected to the same tactics by powerful partners and institutions. Isolation, information control, reality distortion, the gradual erosion of a person's confidence until they begin to question their own memory, their own judgment, their own sanity. I knew the playbook, and knowing it was the only thing that kept me from falling into it. The media campaign began on the 5th day. It started with a small piece in a Danish tabloid, an anonymous source close to the royal household, expressing concern about the princess's health. The article was sympathetic in tone, carefully worded to suggest that Amara, the girl from Kenya, who had captured the prince's heart, was finding the pressures of royal life overwhelming. It mentioned anxiety. It mentioned cultural adjustment difficulties. So it used phrases like, "Sources say she has been struggling," and "those close to her are deeply worried." Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by international outlets. Variations appeared across Europe, each one slightly different, but carrying the same core message. The princess was fragile. The princess was overwhelmed. The princess was not coping. I read every article on the palace-issued tablet that Gerda had left on my desk, and I felt a fury so deep and so controlled that it frightened even me. They were not just trying to silence me. They were building a framework to discredit anything I might say in the future. If I ever went public, if I ever told my story, the world would already have been primed to see me as an unstable woman who cracked under pressure. It was elegant. It was ruthless. Well, and it had the Queen's fingerprints all over it. Kasper came to see me on the 7th night. He stood in the doorway of our bedroom, the bedroom we had shared for months, but that now felt like a holding cell, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was somewhere between guilt and exhaustion, the face of a man trapped between two forces and being slowly crushed by both. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Amara, I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed. But please, I am asking you, let us handle this as a family. My mother is willing to sit down and discuss a path forward that protects everyone." I stared at him. This man I had loved with everything in me. This man whose voice had once made my chest feel like it was full of light. And I searched his words for any sign that he understood what had been done to me, any indication that he grasped the magnitude of the violation. But all I heard was the word family. Not our family, his family, the institution, the crown, the machine that had chewed me up and was now asking me to swallow quietly. I told him I was tired and that we could talk tomorrow. He nodded, kissed my forehead with lips that felt like a stranger's, and left. I listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor, and when the silence returned, I sat up in bed and pulled open the drawer of my nightstand. Beneath a book and a pair of reading glasses was a small folded piece of paper that Priya had given me months ago, back when we first began planning, back when she had told me to keep it somewhere the palace would never think to look. On the paper was a single phone number, and beneath it, written in Priya's sharp handwriting, were 3 words, "When you're ready." I held that piece of paper in my hands and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not fear, certainty. I was ready. And what this palace had built around me, the surveillance, the media narrative, the isolation, the slow, methodical erasure of my voice, all of it was about to become the very evidence that proved everything I had been saying was true. The document arrived on a silver tray. I'm not being poetic. It was literally placed on a silver tray beside a cup of Earl Grey tea and a small porcelain dish of butter cookies, as though what they were asking me to sign was nothing more significant than a dinner menu. Gerda brought it to me in the sitting room on the 9th morning of my confinement, and she stood by the window with her hands clasped while I opened the leather folder and began to read. The agreement was 43 pages long. I know because I counted every single one. It was written in both Danish and English, and it bore the letterhead of the royal household's private legal counsel, a firm that had represented the monarchy for over a century. The language was dense, layered with subclauses and cross-references, and legal terminology designed to overwhelm anyone who wasn't trained to parse it. But I was trained. I had spent years in a London law firm dissecting documents exactly like this one. Documents built to look generous on the surface, while burying their true intent deep in the fine print. And so I read every word, every clause, every carefully constructed sentence, and what I found made my blood run cold. The agreement offered me a financial settlement of 12 million euros. It guaranteed me a residence in any European country of my choosing. It promised that the royal household would issue a joint statement expressing mutual respect and wishing me well in my future endeavors. On the surface, it was more than generous. It was the kind of offer that most people would look at and think, "Take it. Seize walk away rich and free and start a new life." But buried beneath the gilded language were the teeth. Clause 17 prohibited me from making any public or private statements regarding the circumstances of the marriage's dissolution. Clause 22 extended that prohibition to any family members, legal representatives, or associates acting on my behalf. Clause 31 stipulated that any breach of the agreement would result in the immediate forfeiture of the settlement and the initiation of legal proceedings under Danish privacy statutes, proceedings that the document helpfully noted could carry both civil and criminal penalties. And Clause 36, the one that made my hands tremble, not with fear, but with a rage so pure it felt almost holy. We stated that I would acknowledge in writing that I had no knowledge of any matters pertaining to the personal or familial history of Prince Kasper that were not disclosed to me prior to the marriage. They were asking me to sign a document that said I never found out about Marin, that I never read the journal, that the child didn't exist in any version of reality I was permitted to carry with me out of those palace doors. They weren't offering me freedom. They were offering me a purchased silence wrapped in velvet and tied with a bow made of threats. I closed the folder. I looked at Gerda standing by the window. She was watching me with that careful, performative concern that I had come to recognize as the palace's default expression when dealing with a problem they wanted to disappear, where I asked her to thank Her Majesty for the document and to let her know I would need a few days to review it thoroughly. Gerda nodded, collected the tray, and left the room. The moment the door closed behind her, I walked to the window and stood there looking out at the palace gardens, the same gardens where I had once walked freely, where I had whispered into my phone to Priya while the morning dew clung to the hedgerows. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and closed my eyes. And then I began to plan. The next 48 hours were the most precise of my life. On the first night, I waited until Kasper was asleep beside me, his breathing slow and heavy, with the particular exhaustion of a man who was drowning in his own cowardice, and I slipped out of bed. I walked barefoot to the bathroom, locked the door. Cyr turned on the shower to mask any sound, and retrieved Priya's folded piece of paper from where I had moved it, tucked inside the lining of my wash bag. I memorized the number 1 final time. Then I flushed the paper down the toilet and watched it disappear. On the second day, I asked Gerda if I could visit the palace library. She hesitated, consulted someone by phone, and then agreed, accompanying me, of course. In the library, I spent 2 hours reading, or pretending to read, while carefully observing the service entrance at the far end of the corridor. I noted the shift change of the staff who used that entrance. I noted the 15-minute window between 3:45 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when the corridor was empty. I noted the door's lock mechanism, a simple keycard system, the same system used throughout the palace's staff areas. On the third morning, I told Gerda I was feeling unwell and wanted to rest in my room for the afternoon. She accepted this without suspicion because it fit the narrative they had already built. The fragile princess, the overwhelmed outsider, let her rest. She's struggling. It was the first time their lie worked in my favor. At 3:40 in the afternoon, I put on my old wool coat from London. I slipped my passport into the inside pocket, the same passport I had hidden in the coat's lining weeks ago when I first started planning with Priya, because some part of me had always known it might come to this. I carried nothing else. No jewelry, no gifts, no designer clothes from the wardrobes they had filled for me. Nothing that belonged to the palace. Nothing that belonged to the woman they had tried to turn me into. I walked calmly through the residential wing, down the back staircase used by housekeeping staff, along the corridor I had studied in the library, and at 3:47, I pressed a staff key card against the service door's reader. The card had been left on a cleaning cart outside the library the day before. I had taken it in a single fluid motion while Gerda was looking at her phone. The light turned green. The door opened. And just like that, I stepped outside into the cold Danish afternoon. The air hit my face like a slap of freedom, sharp and bracing and so painfully sweet I almost gasped. I walked across the service courtyard, past the loading area, where delivery trucks came and went, through a gate that led to a narrow street behind the palace grounds. A dark blue car was parked 30 meters ahead. Priya had arranged it. I didn't know how, I didn't know through whom, and I didn't care. I walked toward it without looking back, not once. I opened the rear door, sat down, and the driver pulled away from the curb without a word. I watched the palace shrink in the side mirror, its golden spires catching the pale winter light, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. It was grief. Not for the marriage, not for Kasper, but for the version of myself who had walked into that palace, believing that love was enough to make a fairy tale real. That woman was gone now, and the woman sitting in the back of that car, clutching her passport with both hands and breathing like she had just broken the surface after being held underwater for months. That woman was someone new, someone harder, was someone who had learned the most painful lesson a person can learn, that the people who are supposed to love you are sometimes the very ones building the cage around you and calling it protection. The car turned onto the highway, heading toward the airport, and I pressed my hand flat against the window and whispered 3 words into the glass. I am free. And for the first time in what felt like years, I believed it. Please subscribe to this channel if you would like to get notified when we publish stories that you might like. Let's continue with the story. Priya was standing at the arrivals gate at Heathrow with 2 coffees and a face that held the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has been preparing for war and finally heard the first shot fired. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask if I was okay. She looked me in the eyes, handed me the coffee and said, "We have 72 hours before the palace realizes you're not resting in your room. Probably less. We need to move." I followed her to a waiting car, and we drove through London in silence, past streets I had once walked as a law student, past the cafe near King's Cross, where I used to study with highlighters and cheap sandwiches, past the life I had lived before a prince walked into it and rearranged every molecule of my existence. Priya had arranged a flat in Hackney, a small 2-bedroom above a bookshop owned by a friend of a friend who asked no questions and accepted payment in cash. The windows were covered with thick curtains. The Wi-Fi was secured through a VPN. On the kitchen table sat 3 laptops, 2 encrypted hard drives, and a stack of printed documents that represented months of preparation. This was our war room, and the war was about to begin. The first 12 hours were spent reviewing everything. Priya walked me through the legal strategy she and the team had built in my absence. The photographed journal pages had been authenticated by a handwriting expert who confirmed they were written by Kasper. The financial records showing payments to Maren had been cross-referenced with public filings and palace expenditure reports that were available through Danish transparency laws. A timeline had been constructed that proved the royal family had known about the child at least 2 years before my engagement was announced. Every piece of evidence had been cataloged, verified, and stored in multiple secure locations across 3 countries. Priya had thought of everything. She had even drafted 3 separate versions of my public statement, each calibrated for a different scenario depending on how the palace responded. I sat at that kitchen table reading through her work, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Respect for myself. Not the manufactured dignity the palace had draped over me like a costume, but the real, earned respect that comes from knowing you prepared, you planned, and you refused to be erased. We released the statement at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. Priya had chosen the timing deliberately. Midweek, early enough to dominate the European news cycle, late enough that American outlets would pick it up as their morning programming began. The statement was 6 pages long, and I had rewritten it 14 times. Every word was mine. Every sentence had been weighed and measured and stripped of anything that could be dismissed as emotional or vindictive. I did not attack the royal family. I did not call Kasper a liar, even though he was. I did not call the queen a manipulator, even though she was. Instead, I simply told the truth. I described what I had found. I described what had been hidden from me. I described the timeline, the journal, the payments, the child. I described the confrontation in the living room and the days of isolation that followed. Or I described the 43-page silence agreement and what its clauses revealed about the palace's priorities. And I ended with a single paragraph that Priya had told me would be the one the world remembered. I did not leave the Danish royal family because I was fragile, overwhelmed, or unable to cope with the demands of royal life. I left because I discovered that the man I married and the family I joined had made a collective decision before I ever walked down the aisle that I did not deserve the truth. I was not treated as a wife. I was treated as a solution to a problem I was never told existed, and I refuse to be silent about that, not because I want revenge, but because somewhere in the world there is another woman being told that love requires her to shrink, to comply, to accept less than she is worth. I refuse to let my silence become permission for that to continue. The world detonated. Within 3 hours, the statement was the top trending story in 14 countries. Within 6 hours, every major news network on the planet was running it as their lead. Journalists who had published the palace's planted stories about my mental health were now scrambling to retract and reframe. The evidence was methodical, undeniable, and devastating in its clarity. Danish media, which had always treated the royal family with a careful, almost reverential restraint, broke ranks for the first time in decades. Commentators who had once praised Kasper as the modern face of the monarchy were now questioning everything they had been told. The palace issued its first response at 4 o'clock that afternoon. A brief statement calling the allegations deeply misleading and expressing disappointment that private family matters had been made public. It was the wrong move, and they knew it almost immediately. The statement contained no specific denials. It addressed none of the evidence. It was the kind of hollow, institutional language that might have worked 20 years ago, but in the age of social media and real-time fact-checking, it crumbled on contact. By evening, the hashtag had spread to every corner of the internet. Women from across the world were sharing their own stories of being silenced, of being gaslit, of being offered comfort and security in exchange for their voice. My story had become something larger than me. It had become a mirror, and millions of people were looking into it and seeing their own reflections staring back. Prince Kasper called me that night. Priya's phone rang at 11:45, and the screen displayed a Danish number I recognized immediately. She held the phone out to me and raised an eyebrow as if to say, "Your choice." I took it. I pressed the phone to my ear and heard him breathing on the other end, ragged and uneven, the breathing of a man standing at the edge of a cliff he had built with his own hands. He said my name 3 times before he could form a sentence. "Amara! Amara! Amara, why? Why did you do this? We could have handled this privately. We could have found a way." I listened to him, and I felt something I did not expect. Not anger, not satisfaction, pity, because he genuinely believed what he was saying. He genuinely thought there was a version of this where I discovered that my entire marriage was built on a conspiracy and quietly accepted a check and walked away with my mouth sewn shut. He could not comprehend why I had spoken, because he had been raised in a world where silence was currency and truth was a threat to be managed. He was not a monster. He was something worse. He was a man who had been taught that love and control were the same thing and had never once questioned the lesson. I held the phone for a long time, listening to him wait for my response, listening to the static between 2 people who had once shared a bed and now shared nothing but the wreckage of a lie. And then I said the only thing left to say. "Kasper, I didn't do this to you. I did this for me." I handed the phone back to Priya. She ended the call, and I sat in that small flat above the bookshop in Hackney, wrapped in my old wool coat, and I cried. Not because I was broken, but because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had used my own voice, and the world had listened, and the sound of it was so powerful, and so terrifying, and so beautiful, that my body didn't know how to hold it all at once. So I let it spill, and I let myself feel every drop of it. And then I dried my face, opened my laptop, and began preparing for what came next. Kasper's televised address was broadcast at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening, 3 days after my statement had set the world on fire. Every major network carried it live. Priya and I watched it on her laptop in the Hackney flat, sitting side by side on the small sofa with the curtains drawn and the room lit only by the blue glow of the screen. He stood behind a podium in one of the palace's formal reception rooms, the one with the oil paintings of former kings lining the walls and the Danish flag positioned just over his right shoulder. He wore a dark gray suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a carefully calculated gesture of vulnerability. His hair was combed, but not perfect. His eyes were tired but steady. Someone had coached him. Every detail of his appearance had been engineered to project a man who was suffering with dignity, a man who had been through something painful and was bravely facing the public to speak from his heart. Except the words that came out of his mouth did not come from his heart. They came from the palace's communications office, filtered through the Queen's approval, and polished until every edge had been sanded down to nothing. He began by thanking the Danish people for their patience and understanding during what he called a deeply personal and difficult time. He expressed his profound sadness at the breakdown of his marriage and spoke about me with a tenderness so perfectly performed that it almost made me believe it was real. He called me remarkable. He called me courageous. He said that he would always hold our time together as one of the most meaningful chapters of his life, and that he wished me nothing but peace and happiness in whatever path I chose going forward. It was beautiful. It was eloquent. It was the most sophisticated lie I had ever heard a man tell on live television. Because in 4 minutes and 37 seconds of speaking, he did not once mention Marin. He did not mention the child. He did not acknowledge the journal or the secret or the 2 years of meetings that took place before our wedding to ensure I would never find out. He did not address a single piece of the evidence I had released. He spoke about our marriage as though it had simply run its natural course, as though 2 people had grown apart the way people sometimes do, as though the only story here was a love that didn't last. He erased everything, standing behind that podium with his rehearsed sorrow and his unbuttoned collar. He looked directly into the camera and erased the truth as if it had never existed. I watched his face on that screen, and I searched for the man I had married. The man who had knelt on the floor of that London flat and slid a ring onto my finger with shaking hands. The man who had once told me that I was the bravest person he had ever met. I searched, and all I found was a prince. Not a husband, not a partner. A prince doing what princes are trained to do, which is to protect the throne at any cost, even if the cost is the woman who loved him most. When the broadcast ended, Priya closed the laptop gently and looked at me. She didn't ask how I felt. She could see it, the last thread of hope I had been carrying, the thin, stubborn, irrational thread that maybe he would surprise me, maybe he would choose truth, maybe he would stand behind that podium and say, "Yes, I lied, and I'm sorry." That thread snapped so cleanly, I swear I heard it. And what rushed into the space it left behind was not anger or devastation. It was clarity, the purest, sharpest clarity I had ever known. He had made his choice, and his choice was not me. It was never going to be me. The Queen's statement came 2 days later, released through the palace's official channels in a written format with no press conference and no questions permitted. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first acknowledged that Prince Kasper had a child from a previous relationship. The second stated that the matter had been handled privately and with the full knowledge of the immediate family. The third expressed the royal household's hope that the media and public would respect the privacy of all parties involved, particularly the child. That was it. 3 paragraphs to address a conspiracy that had spanned years. 3 paragraphs to rewrite history. The statement framed the existence of Kasper's child as something the family had always intended to disclose at the appropriate time, as though they had been waiting for the right moment rather than actively building a fortress of silence around it. There was no mention of me, no acknowledgement that I had been deliberately excluded from this information. No recognition that a woman had married into this family without being told the most fundamental truth about the man she was marrying. In the Queen's version of events, I simply did not factor into the equation, so I was a footnote in a story she had already decided the ending to, long before I ever appeared in its pages. Maren surfaced in the media the following week, not by choice. The tabloids found her. Photographs appeared of a tall blonde woman hurrying through the streets of Aarhus with a young child bundled in a winter coat, her face turned away from the cameras, her hand raised to shield the boy from the flashing lights. I looked at those photographs for a long time. I studied her face in the moments when her guard was down, and I saw something I recognized: exhaustion, fear. The look of a woman who had been caught in the machinery of an institution far more powerful than herself and was now being ground between its gears. I did not hate her. I had expected to. I had imagined this moment many times during those long, isolated days in the palace. Imagined what I would feel when I finally saw the face of the woman my husband had been with. The woman who had borne his child, while the world was being told he was a bachelor prince waiting for true love. But looking at those photographs, all I felt was a strange, heavy kinship. She had been used too. Differently than me, but used all the same. Kept in a separate cage with different bars, but the same lock. The palace had managed her just as they had managed me, with money and silence, and the implicit understanding that the monarchy's image mattered more than any single person's life. My mother called me on a Sunday night. It was late, almost midnight in London, which meant it was 2 a.m. in Kenya. And I knew before I answered that something was different because my mother never called at that hour unless the weight of something had become too heavy to carry alone until morning. I answered and pressed the phone to my ear, and for a long time there was nothing, just her breathing, slow, steady, the sound of a woman sitting in the dark in a small house in Makueni County, thousands of miles away from her daughter, processing the reality that the whole world now knew the most intimate details of her child's pain. She didn't ask me questions. She didn't offer advice. She didn't say, "I told you so," or "come home," or "why didn't you listen?" She just breathed, and I breathed with her. 2 women connected by a phone line that stretched across continents, across oceans, see across the vast, impossible distance between a mother's prayers and the life her daughter had actually lived. And in that silence, I heard everything she could not say. I heard her grief at not being able to protect me. I heard her pride at what I had done. I heard her fear about what would come next. I heard the sound of a mother's heart holding itself together by sheer force of will. Because falling apart was not an option when your child still needed you to be whole. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke. One sentence. Her voice was rough with the kind of emotion that lives below language, below thought, in the place where love exists in its most raw and unrefined form. She said, "You are still my daughter, and nothing they have done has changed that." I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep the sound inside, but it escaped anyway. So a sob so deep it felt like it had been living in my chest since the day I first walked through those palace doors. And my mother held the line. She held it through every wave. She held it until I was empty and quiet and breathing again. And then she said goodnight, and the line went silent. And I sat on the floor of that flat in Hackney and understood something that no palace and no prince and no crown could ever teach me. That the most powerful thing in the world is not a throne. It is a mother who refuses to let her child forget who she is. Please subscribe to this channel if you would like to get notified when we publish stories that you might like. Let's continue with the story. The flight to Nairobi was 11 hours long. I sat in a window seat near the back of the plane, economy class, wedged between a businessman who slept with his mouth open and a young Kenyan woman returning home from university in Manchester, who spent the first hour stealing glances at me before finally leaning over and whispering, "Are you here? Are you the princess?" I looked at her. This girl who couldn't have been older than 22, with her braided hair and her university hoodie, and her eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. And I said, "I'm not a princess, I'm just going home." She nodded slowly, as though she understood something in those words that went deeper than their surface. And she didn't ask me anything else for the rest of the flight. But somewhere over the Mediterranean, she reached into her bag and pulled out a packet of biscuits and placed them on the armrest between us without a word. I ate 3 of them and stared out the window at the clouds below and thought about how the smallest kindnesses from strangers can sometimes hold you together when the biggest promises from the people you love have already fallen apart. Nairobi hit me like a wall of memory. The heat, the noise, the smell of diesel and red earth, and roasting maize drifting through the open windows of the taxi as we crawled through traffic on Mombasa Road. I had not been back in over a year. The palace had scheduled 2 official visits to Kenya during my time as princess, both of which had been meticulously choreographed events involving motorcades and security details, and carefully selected photo opportunities at schools and hospitals. I had smiled and waved and shaken hands, and never once set foot in Makueni County, because the palace's advance team had deemed it logistically unsuitable, which was their polite way of saying that the dirt roads and modest houses of my childhood didn't fit the image they were trying to project. They had brought me to Kenya and kept me from the only part of it that mattered. But not today. Today, there was no motorcade, no security detail, no schedule printed on palace stationery. There was just me, a worn leather bag, and a matatu heading southeast toward the place where I began. The drive from Nairobi to Makueni took 4 hours. The roads narrowed as the city fell away, tarmac giving way to Murram, the landscape shifting from concrete and glass to open sky and acacia trees and the long red stretches of earth that looked like the land itself was bleeding. I watched it all through the dusty window of the matatu, pressed between bodies and bags, and the sound of Kemba music playing from someone's phone, and I felt something loosening inside me with every kilometer. Like a knot that had been pulled tighter and tighter for months was finally, slowly, beginning to unravel. By the time we reached Wote Town, the sun was hanging low and orange over the hills, and the air smelled like wood smoke and ripening mangoes. and I stepped off the Matatu onto the same dusty road I had walked as a child, carrying my school books in a plastic bag because we couldn't afford a proper backpack. I stood there for a long time, just stood there, and feeling the earth beneath my feet, letting it hold me. My mother was waiting at the gate. She didn't run, she didn't wave. She stood with her hands at her sides and her head held high, wearing her favorite green Katange wrap and the expression of a woman who had prayed her daughter home and was not surprised that God had listened. I walked toward her, and with every step I felt another piece of the palace fall away from me like dead skin. The titles, the protocols, the rigid, suffocating architecture of a life that was never designed for someone like me. By the time I reached her, I was shaking, not with cold, not with fear, with the overwhelming sensation of arriving somewhere after being lost for so long that you had forgotten what arrival felt like. She took my face in both her hands. Her palms were rough and warm. The hands of a woman who had spent 30 years kneading dough and raising children and building a life out of nothing but faith and determination. She looked at me the way only a mother can look at her child, as though she could see every version of me at once. The girl, the student, the lawyer, the princess, the woman standing before her now with nothing left but herself. And she said, "You are home. That is enough. Everything else we figure out tomorrow." The first week back, I did nothing. I slept in my old bedroom, the same small room with the concrete floor and the window that didn't close properly, and the faded curtain my mother had sewn from leftover fabric when I was 12. I ate her food. Chapati and sukuma wiki and beans, slow cooked with tomatoes and onions until they melted into something that tasted like every safe memory I had ever made. I sat in the plastic chair outside the bakery and watched the village move around me. Women carrying water, children chasing each other through the dust, boda riders weaving between goats on the road, and I let the rhythm of this place seep back into my bones. I didn't check the news. I didn't look at social media. I didn't call Priya. I just existed. And existing, I discovered, was the most radical act of healing available to a woman who had spent months having her existence controlled, monitored, and slowly erased by people who claimed to care about her. The second week, I began to walk. Long walks through the countryside that passed farms and churches and small shops selling everything from phone credit to cooking oil. I walked until my legs ached and my mind quieted, and the noise of the world outside this place faded to a frequency I could manage. I visited my old primary school, stood outside the classroom where I had first learned to read, and pressed my hand against the rough concrete wall, as though I could absorb through my skin the memory of the girl who had sat inside it, dreaming of a life beyond these hills. That girl had dreamed big. She had dreamed of London and law degrees, and a life that sparkled with possibility. And she had gotten everything she dreamed of, only to discover that the sparkling life she had built was a gilded trap, and that the truest version of herself had been here all along, rooted in this red earth, and he's waiting for her to come back and reclaim it. On the 15th day, I opened my laptop for the first time. I sat at the small table in my mother's kitchen, with the sound of her humming gospel songs drifting in from the bakery, and I began to write. Not my statement, not a legal document, not a response to the palace or the media or the millions of strangers who had opinions about my life. I wrote for myself. I wrote about who I was before the palace. I wrote about the scholarship that changed my life, and the professor in London who told me I had one of the sharpest legal minds he had ever encountered. I wrote about the day I graduated, and my mother cried so hard she had to leave the ceremony. I wrote about the woman I had been before Kasper, before the ring, before the fairy tale swallowed me whole. And I realized as the words poured out of me that I had not lost her. She had been there the entire time, buried beneath layers of protocol and expectation, and the relentless, suffocating weight of trying to become someone else's version of acceptable. I wrote until the sun went down, and my mother brought me tea and placed her hand on my shoulder without reading a single word because she understood that some things are not written to be read. They are written to be released. And somewhere between the first sentence and the last, I made a decision. I was going to build something, not a palace, not a fairy tale, something real, something rooted in this soil and in the fire that my mother always said was in my bones. I didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but I knew it would be mine, and that was enough to begin. I chose a rooftop, not a press room, not a television studio, not a palace balcony framed by flags and centuries of inherited authority. A rooftop in Nairobi, overlooking the city skyline at golden hour, with the sun melting into the horizon and the sound of traffic and life, and millions of ordinary people living their ordinary, extraordinary lives, drifting up from the streets below. Priya had suggested a sit-down interview with one of the major international networks. She had offers from all of them. Every broadcaster in the world wanted the first on-camera conversation with a woman who had walked out of a European monarchy and set it on fire with the truth. But I said no. I didn't want someone else's questions shaping my story. I didn't want an interviewer's raised eyebrow or carefully timed pause deciding which parts of my life mattered most. I had spent too long letting other people control the frame. This time, the frame was mine. So Priya arranged a single camera, a single microphone, and a single take. No edits, no script, no teleprompter. Just me, standing on that rooftop with Nairobi spread out behind me like a promise, speaking directly into the lens the way you speak to someone you trust, with the most honest version of yourself. I wore my mother's kiringe, the green one, the one she had been wearing the day I came home, the one she had pressed into my hands that morning and said, "Wear this so they know where you come from." I wrapped it around my shoulders like armor made of love, and I stood in front of that camera and I began to speak. I told them about the girl from Makueni, not the princess, not the headline, the girl. I told them about the red dirt roads and the bakery that smelled like warm dough at 4 a.m, and the mother who woke before dawn every single day of her life so that her daughter could have the privilege of dreaming. I told them about the plastic bag I carried my books in and the scholarship letter that arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and changed the entire trajectory of my existence. I told them about landing in London at 19 years old with one suitcase and a heart so full of ambition it felt like it might burst through my ribs. I told them about law school and late nights and the slow, grueling, beautiful process of building a self from nothing but discipline and refusal to quit. I told them that before I was ever a princess, I was a woman who had earned every single thing she had with her own 2 hands, and that was the part of the story the world had somehow forgotten. Then I told them about love, not the fairy tale version, the real version. I told them what it feels like to be chosen by someone powerful and how intoxicating that feeling is, how it wraps around you like sunlight and makes you believe that you have been seen, truly seen, for the first time in your life. I told them how dangerous that feeling can be when the person doing the choosing has already decided who you are allowed to become. I told them about the slow erosion, not dramatic, not violent, subtle, the way they replaced my clothes first, then my schedule, then my language, then my friends, then my instincts, then my voice. Until I woke up one morning in a palace bedroom and looked in the mirror and could not find a single trace of the woman who had walked in. I told them that the most terrifying prison is the one decorated so beautifully you forget you are not free. I told them about the journal, not the details. The world already had those. I told them about the moment, the specific, singular, world-ending moment when I opened those pages and understood that the foundation of my marriage was not love. It was management. I had been selected, vetted, and approved, not because Kasper loved me, although perhaps some part of him did, but because I solved a problem. A foreign bride, no connections to Danish society, no family with political influence who might ask uncomfortable questions. A woman so grateful for the fairy tale that she would never think to look beneath it. I told them how it felt to realize that the greatest love story of your life was actually a strategic decision made in a boardroom, and I watched the camera lens catch the last light of the sun as I said it, and I did not flinch. Then I told them what I wanted them to remember. Not the betrayal, not the palace, not the prince or the queen, or the secret child, or the silence agreement, or the media stories designed to make me look fragile. I told them to remember the choice, because that is what this story is really about. It is about the moment a woman realizes that the life she has been given is not the life she deserves, and she decides, despite every force arrayed against her, despite the money and the power and the machinery of an institution designed to outlast any individual, she decides that her truth matters more than their comfort. I told them that I stood in a living room in a palace and asked a queen a question she couldn't answer, and in that silence, I discovered something that no title and no crown could ever give me. I discovered that my voice, the one they spent months trying to muffle and manage and medicate into submission, was the most powerful thing I owned. And I would never let anyone take it from me again. I paused. The city hummed below me. The sun was almost gone, just a thin line of gold bleeding along the edge of the sky. And I said the last thing I had come to say. My mother told me something when I was a girl. She said, "Amara, there is fire in your bones. It was put there by God, and no man on earth can put it out." I spent years believing that the fire she was talking about was ambition, the drive that took me from a village in Makweni to a law degree in London to a throne in Copenhagen. But she wasn't talking about ambition. She was talking about something older than that, something deeper. She was talking about the part of a woman that knows, even when the whole world is telling her otherwise, that she is worth more than what she has been given. That part of me never died. It burned low sometimes. It flickered in those long, silent nights in the palace when I wondered if I had made the biggest mistake of my life. But it never went out. And when I needed it most, when I was alone and afraid and surrounded by people who wanted me to disappear quietly, that fire is what got me out of bed. So it is what made me photograph those pages. It is what made me stand in front of a queen and refuse to sit down. It is what carried me out of that palace in an old wool coat with nothing but my passport and my dignity. And it is what brought me home. I looked directly into the camera one last time. The red light blinked steadily, carrying my voice across oceans and borders and time zones to every screen in every room where someone needed to hear what I was about to say. To every woman who has ever been silenced by someone who claimed to love her. To every woman who has been told that keeping the peace is more important than telling the truth. To every woman sitting in a beautiful room wondering why she feels so empty. I want you to know something. The fire is still in your bones. It has always been there. And no one, no prince, no queen, or no institution, no amount of money or threats or carefully worded agreements, no one gets to put it out. That is not their right. It was never their right. The only person who gets to decide what you do with your fire is you. I stopped. The camera held on my face for a long moment. Behind me, Nairobi glittered in the early dark, alive and loud and unapologetically itself. Priya lowered the camera and looked at me, and for the first time since I had known her, that unshakable woman had tears running down her face. She didn't wipe them. She just nodded once, slowly, the way you nod when there are no words adequate for the moment, and silence is the only language that fits. I unwrapped my mother's kaiteng from my shoulders and held it against my chest and breathed in the scent of home that still clung to its fabric. The video was uploaded that night, unedited, exactly as we recorded it. By morning, it had been viewed 47 million times. But I didn't watch the numbers climb. I didn't read the comments or the headlines or the think pieces that would follow for weeks and months and years. I went back to my mother's house in Makueni. I sat in the plastic chair outside the bakery. I drank tea, and I watched the sun rise over the hills, the same hills I had looked at as a girl when the world was small and the future was enormous, and the fire in my bones was just beginning to catch. It was still burning. It would always be burning. And for the first time in my life, I understood exactly what it was for.